I'm Jameel Jaffer. I'm a Deputy Legal Director at the ACLU. And we've brought this lawsuit over the last week challenging the constitutionality of the dragnet phone spying program that was disclosed in The Guardian about a week ago. And the argument is that this kind of surveillance implicates the Fourth Amendment, that the government is able to, with this kind of metadata surveillance, build profiles of every single American by studying the phone calls that he or she makes, the length of the phone calls, the identities of the people who are called, the locations that each of us goes every day. It's really an extremely intrusive surveillance program that every American is now subject to. It's as if at the end of every day, every person living in the United States had to file a report with the government, telling the government, here are the people I called, here's when I called them, here's how long the conversations were, here's where I went, here are the places I went today, because the government can track all of this with metadata through your cell phone. And then the government juxtaposes all of that information with all sorts of other information that it gets from credit reporting companies, from banks, and the government has these dossiers on every single person living in the United States. And this is it's no exaggeration to say that no other democratic government has ever subjected its own citizens to surveillance of this kind. This is an experiment. And our argument is simply that this kind of surveillance should not be beyond the reach of the Fourth Amendment. The government should have to justify this surveillance under the Fourth Amendment. And our view is that this kind of dragnet program won't be justified under the Constitution, that the government will be able to explain that this kind of information is sometimes valuable and that it should sometimes have access to it. But it's a different thing altogether to say that every American should be subject to it permanently. And we now know that that's exactly what's going on, that at least for at least 7 years, the government has been collecting all of this information. It does explain why the government is building this massive data center in Utah, because to store this kind of information, you really do need the kind of facility that the government is building there. It's obviously true that in some circumstances, this kind of information is going to be valuable to the government. But it's one thing to accept that, and another thing to say that the government should have this kind of information about every one of us on an ongoing basis. It's true that if the government had access to everybody's house without a warrant, it would probably discover in some houses evidence of criminal activity, maybe even evidence of terrorism. But we draw the line because we want to have some degree of privacy. That's what it means to live in a society that's not a totalitarian one, that there is some degree of privacy that the government can't intrude on without justification. And here the government is intruding on it without individualized justification of any kind. The government is not saying we need this person's information for these reasons. The government is saying we need everybody's information for no specific reason right now, because at some point in the future that information may be valuable. And if the Fourth Amendment prohibits anything, it's surely that kind of dragnet surveillance that's not based on individualized suspicion of any kind. In fact, the whole point of the Fourth Amendment was to prohibit general warrants that were not particularized, that were not based on individualized suspicion. And I think it's fair to say that what we're looking at now is general warrants for the digital age. That's what the government is proposing and defending here.